You're a Venetian ambassador in 1515, entering the magnificent Palazzo Medici in Florence, expecting to negotiate with the heir to Europe's most powerful banking empire. Instead, you encounter something that will haunt your dreams for years to come. The young man before you cannot hold his head steady. His hands shake uncontrollably as he attempts to sign documents. When he tries to speak, only slurred whispers emerge from lips that seem perpetually twisted in pain. His own servants avert their eyes when addressing him, crossing themselves when they think no one is watching. This is Lorenzo di Piero di Medici, heir to a fortune that could buy kingdoms, yet cursed with a body that betrays him at every turn. The Florentines whisper that he is Il Maledetto, the cursed one. But here's the terrifying truth that no one dared speak aloud. Lorenzo wasn't cursed by witchcraft or divine punishment. He was cursed by something far more insidious: his own family's obsession with genetic purity and political control. This is the story of how Europe's most successful banking dynasty destroyed itself from within, creating a monster heir who would trigger the collapse of an empire that had ruled European finance for over 2 centuries. To understand the horror that was Lorenzo di Piero, we must first enter the twisted mindset of the Medici banking empire. For over 100 years, this family had controlled the flow of money across Europe. Their banks stretched from London to Constantinople, from Naples to Bruges. They had financed kings, elected popes, and accumulated wealth that dwarfed entire nations. The Medici weren't just bankers, they were the puppet masters of European politics. But this unprecedented power came with a terrifying price. The Medici had developed an obsession with what they called preserving the bloodline's financial genius. In their warped logic, this didn't just mean marrying within the merchant class. It meant systematically intermarrying with the same handful of Florentine banking families, generation after generation, creating an ever-tightening web of genetic relationships. Consider this nightmare. Lorenzo di Piero had a coefficient of inbreeding of 0.187, nearly as high as if his parents had been first cousins. But Lorenzo wasn't the product of a single generation of close marriage. He was the final result of 7 consecutive generations of strategic marriages. Within the same 5 Florentine families, the Medici, Pazzi, Tornabuoni, Salviati, and Rucellai, bloodlines had become so intertwined that family trees looked more like genetic spider webs. Where a normal person has 16 different great-great-grandparents, Lorenzo had only 9. The same names appeared over and over in different positions on his family tree. Lucretia Tornabuoni was simultaneously his great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother, and great-great-great-grandmother through different marriage lines. Giovanni de' Medici appeared as his ancestor through no fewer than 6 different lineages. The Medici rulers knew exactly what they were doing. Banking records from the 15th century show that family advisors had calculated the genetic relationships with mathematical precision. They weren't accidentally marrying close relatives, they were deliberately concentrating what they believed were financial genius genes by systematically eliminating genetic diversity. From their bloodline, Lorenzo's father, Piero di Lorenzo di Medici, had already shown signs of the genetic catastrophe to come. Court physicians noted his peculiar nervous afflictions and weakness of the limbs, but these were carefully hidden from public view. When Piero died at the unusually young age of 42, the family doctors listed exhaustion from banking duties as the cause of death. The reality was far more disturbing. His body had simply begun shutting down, unable to cope with the genetic damage accumulated over generations. When Lorenzo di Piero was born on September 12, 1492, the very day Columbus set sail for the Americas, the midwives in the Palazzo Medici fell into terrified silence. There were no celebrations, no ringing of bells to announce the birth of the banking heir. Instead, there was a whispered horror that spread through the palazzo like plague. The child was grotesquely deformed in ways that defied Renaissance understanding of medicine. His head was abnormally large and misshapen, with a skull that seemed to bulge at impossible angles. His eyes were positioned so far apart that he appeared almost alien. But most disturbing of all were his limbs, stick-thin arms and legs, that shook with uncontrollable tremors from the moment of birth. The family's response was immediate and ruthless. The midwives were paid enormous sums and sworn to secrecy under threat of exile from Florence. The attending physician, Dr. Marsilio Ficino, was forced to sign documents declaring the heir perfectly formed and healthy. Palace guards were stationed outside the nursery with orders to admit no one, without explicit permission from Lorenzo the Magnificent himself. For the first 5 years of his life, Lorenzo di Piero was essentially imprisoned in his own home, while other noble children were displayed at court ceremonies and public festivals. The Medici heir remained hidden behind palazzo walls. The few servants allowed to care for him reported disturbing details in their private correspondence. The child couldn't hold up his own head until age 4. He couldn't sit upright without support until age 6. Most terrifyingly, he seemed to be in constant pain, emitting low moaning sounds even in his sleep. Dr. Antonio Benevini, one of Renaissance Italy's most respected physicians, was secretly brought to examine Lorenzo when he was 7 years old. His private notes, discovered centuries later, paint a picture of medical horror that defied contemporary understanding. Benevini wrote that the child's nervous system appeared to be at war with itself, with muscles that would contract and relax without any apparent cause. The boy's speech was limited to incomprehensible sounds, and his coordination was so poor that he couldn't feed himself. But perhaps most heartbreaking was Benevini's observation about Lorenzo's intelligence. Behind the physical disabilities, the physician detected a sharp mind trapped in a rebellious body. Lorenzo seemed aware of his condition and would often weep when he caught sight of his own reflection. Palace mirrors were eventually removed from his quarters to spare him this psychological torment. The Medici family's strategy for dealing with their catastrophically disabled heir was elaborate deception on an unprecedented scale. They created what historians would later call the greatest fraud in banking history, a systematic campaign to present Lorenzo as a capable leader, while hiding the reality of his condition from everyone outside the immediate family circle. The palazzo underwent extensive renovations designed specifically to accommodate Lorenzo's disabilities, while maintaining the illusion of normalcy. Special furniture was commissioned that could support his weak frame while appearing decorative. His personal chambers were redesigned with hidden passages that allowed servants to assist him without being seen by visitors. Most ingeniously, a series of one-way mirrors were installed that permitted Lorenzo to observe important meetings without having to participate directly. When Lorenzo reached his teenage years and could no longer be completely hidden, the family implemented increasingly desperate measures. They hired a team of actors to serve as Lorenzo's voice during important negotiations. These men would stand behind specially designed screens, speaking Lorenzo's supposed words while he remained hidden from view. Foreign bankers and political leaders were told this was a Medici tradition designed to maintain mystique and authority. The most elaborate deception involved Lorenzo's supposed education. The family hired some of Renaissance Italy's greatest scholars, including Angelo Poliziano and Pico della Mirandola, to publicly praise Lorenzo's intellectual achievements. These men wrote glowing letters about their brilliant student, describing philosophical discussions and mathematical innovations that never actually occurred. In reality, Lorenzo could barely comprehend simple conversations, let alone engage in scholarly debate. Banking transactions became increasingly problematic as Lorenzo aged. His hands shook so violently that he couldn't sign his own name legibly. The family solved this by commissioning a mechanical device, essentially a Renaissance-era signature stamp, that could reproduce Lorenzo's signature consistently. Thousands of contracts and financial documents were signed using this device. While Lorenzo remained hidden away in the palazzo, the psychological toll on the family was immense. Lorenzo the Magnificent, his grandfather, had built the family's reputation on personal charisma and intellectual brilliance. Now they were forced to watch their dynasty's future crumble, while maintaining a facade of strength and prosperity. Private letters from family members revealed deep depression, alcoholism, and what we might now recognize as symptoms of severe anxiety disorders. By 1510, when Lorenzo di Piero was 18 years old, his condition had deteriorated to the point where even the elaborate deceptions couldn't hide the truth. His tremors had become so severe that he required constant physical support to remain upright. His speech had regressed to unintelligible mumbles punctuated by involuntary crying. Most disturbing of all, he had developed what court physicians described as fits of uncontrollable rage, where he would thrash about violently, sometimes injuring servants who tried to calm him. The banking empire began showing signs of the coming collapse. Without a competent leader, crucial financial decisions were delayed or made by committee, leading to missed opportunities and failed investments. The Medici banks in London and Bruges reported significant losses as competitors exploited the family's obvious weakness. Rival banking houses like the Fuggers and Welsers began aggressively pursuing Medici clients, spreading rumors about the heir's incapacity. When Renaissance medicine failed to explain or treat Lorenzo di Piero's condition, the Medici family turned to increasingly desperate religious solutions. What followed were some of the most bizarre and disturbing spiritual interventions ever documented in banking history. Father Girolamo Savonarola, the fiery Dominican friar who had once condemned Medici excess, was secretly brought to the Palazzo. In 1511, despite his public criticism of the family, Savonarola agreed to attempt an exorcism on Lorenzo, believing the heir was possessed by demons sent to punish the Medici for their financial sins. The exorcism sessions were conducted in the Palazzo's private chapel, with only immediate family members present, according to surviving accounts from Lorenzo's aunt, Maddalena de' Medici. These ceremonies were horrifying spectacles that lasted for hours. Savonarola would force Lorenzo to drink holy water mixed with ground religious relics, causing violent vomiting and convulsions that the priest interpreted as demons. Fighting the sacred substances, Lorenzo's already fragile body couldn't tolerate these aggressive interventions. After each session, he would remain bedridden for days, his tremors more severe than before. Yet the family's desperation drove them to approve increasingly extreme measures. Additional priests were brought in to perform group exorcisms, with Lorenzo subjected to aggressive physical manipulations, as multiple clerics attempted to drive out supposed evil spirits. The religious interventions weren't limited to exorcisms. The family commissioned expensive pilgrimages to sacred sites across Europe, hoping that exposure to holy relics might cure their heir. Lorenzo was secretly transported to Santiago di Compostela, Canterbury, and even Rome, carried on specially designed litters that concealed his condition from other pilgrims. These journeys were both logistically nightmarish and medically disastrous. Lorenzo's nervous system couldn't cope with the stress of travel, leading to increasingly severe seizures and episodes of complete catatonia. During the pilgrimage to Canterbury in 1513, Lorenzo suffered what appears to have been a complete nervous breakdown, remaining unconscious for 3 days. While the family frantically tried to find medical help in a foreign country, perhaps most tragically, these religious interventions seemed to worsen Lorenzo's mental state. Previously, despite his physical limitations, he had shown moments of clarity and even joy. After months of exorcisms and forced pilgrimages, he became withdrawn and seemed to live in constant fear. Servants reported that he would cower when priests entered his chambers and would begin crying whenever religious music was played. The most devastating consequence of Lorenzo di Piero's condition was his complete inability to fulfill the most basic requirement of dynastic leadership, producing an heir. This wasn't merely a personal tragedy, it was a political and financial catastrophe that would ultimately destroy the Medici banking empire. In 1512, as political pressure mounted for Lorenzo to marry and secure the family succession, the Medici arranged his engagement to Filiberta of Savoy, a French princess whose family desperately needed Medici financial backing. The engagement negotiations were conducted entirely through intermediaries, with Filiberta never meeting her intended husband before the wedding ceremony. The wedding itself was a masterpiece of deception and a disaster of epic proportions. Held in the magnificent Duomo of Florence, it appeared to outside observers as a celebration worthy of banking royalty. Lorenzo was positioned behind specially designed ceremonial screens that concealed his tremors while allowing him to participate in the ritual responses. The ceremony was carefully choreographed so that he never had to stand unsupported or speak clearly enough for the congregation to understand his words. Filiberta arrived in Florence, expecting to marry the heir to Europe's greatest banking fortune. Instead, she discovered that her husband was a man who could barely care for himself, let alone lead a financial empire. The wedding night was reportedly a catastrophe that left both spouses traumatized. Palace servants later testified that Filiberta emerged from the bridal chamber in tears, while Lorenzo appeared confused and distressed by expectations he was physically and mentally incapable of meeting. The harsh reality was that Lorenzo's genetic condition had left him with severely underdeveloped reproductive organs and the sexual maturity of a prepubescent child. Renaissance physicians had no understanding of hormonal disorders or genetic developmental delays, so they could only describe what they observed: a grown man with the physical and emotional capacity of a young boy, rather than acknowledging Lorenzo's condition. The Medici family chose to blame Filiberta for the couple's inability to produce children. She was subjected to humiliating medical examinations and painful fertility treatments that Renaissance medicine believed could overcome barrenness. Court physicians forced her to consume disgusting herbal concoctions, undergo invasive procedures, and endure constant scrutiny from a family desperate for an heir their son could never provide. The psychological torture was devastating. Philiberta, once described by French courtiers as intelligent and vivacious, became increasingly withdrawn and depressed. She spent most of her time in prayer, begging God for a miracle that would never come. Her private letters to her family in Savoy paint a picture of absolute despair, describing her marriage as a living tomb and Lorenzo as more pitiable than frightening, but impossible to love or live with. After 3 years of marriage without producing a child, Philiberta died mysteriously at age 24. While the official cause was listed as fever, many historians suspect suicide or possibly accidental poisoning from the constant fertility treatments forced upon her. Her death eliminated any hope of a legitimate Medici heir and pushed the family into even more desperate measures. The Medici briefly considered arranging a second marriage for Lorenzo, but his condition had deteriorated so severely by 1515 that even the most desperate noble families refused to consider alliance with the banking dynasty. Lorenzo could no longer maintain the pretense of normalcy, even during carefully choreographed public appearances. His tremors had become so violent that he required restraints during important meetings, and his mental capacity had regressed to the point where he could no longer understand basic financial concepts. As Lorenzo di Piero's disability became increasingly impossible to hide, rival banking families and political enemies began systematically exploiting Medici weakness. The result was a coordinated campaign of financial warfare that would ultimately destroy Europe's most powerful banking empire. The Pazzi family, traditional rivals of the Medici, were the first to recognize the opportunity presented by Lorenzo's incapacity. Led by Francesco Pazzi, they began spreading carefully crafted rumors about the heir's condition throughout European banking circles. These weren't wild accusations, but precisely accurate descriptions of Lorenzo's disabilities shared with key financial partners who had been wondering about the young man's notable absence from important negotiations. By 1514, major Medici clients including the English crown and the Papal States had begun quietly transferring their accounts to competing banks. The Fugger banking house of Augsburg launched an aggressive expansion into Medici territories, offering better terms and emphasizing their family's obvious competence and stability. Jacob Fugger personally traveled to Florence, ostensibly for diplomatic reasons, but actually to assess the rumors about Lorenzo's condition. What Fugger discovered exceeded even his expectations. During a formal dinner at the Palazzo Medici, Lorenzo suffered a severe seizure that left him unconscious on the dining room floor while foreign dignitaries watched in horror. The incident couldn't be explained away or hidden, and within weeks, detailed accounts had spread throughout European banking networks. The political consequences were equally devastating. The Medici had maintained their power through a complex web of alliances, loans, and financial obligations that required constant personal attention and negotiation. With Lorenzo unable to participate in these relationships, the family's political influence began rapidly eroding. Pope Leo X, himself a Medici, was forced to distance himself from his own family to maintain Vatican credibility. The French crown, heavily indebted to Medici banks, began exploring alternative financing arrangements. Most catastrophically, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V started negotiating directly with Fugger banking representatives, effectively ending the Medici monopoly on imperial finance. The family's desperate attempts to maintain control through regency arrangements and proxy leadership only accelerated their decline. Other banking houses correctly interpreted these measures as admission of Lorenzo's incapacity and moved aggressively to capture Medici market share. Within 2 years, the family had lost over 60% of their international business and were facing bankruptcy for the first time in their history. By 1516, the Medici banking empire that had dominated European finance for over 2 centuries was in free fall. Lorenzo di Piero, the heir who was supposed to continue this legacy, spent his days hidden in palazzo chambers, his condition so severe that he could no longer recognize family members or understand where he was. The final collapse came with shocking swiftness. In early 1519, Lorenzo di Piero's condition deteriorated to the point where he could no longer leave his bed. His tremors had become constant and so violent that he required physical restraints to prevent self-injury. His mental capacity had regressed completely. He could no longer speak coherently, recognize faces, or perform any basic personal care. The family brought in Dr. Giovanni da Vigo, one of Europe's most respected physicians, for a final consultation. His private report, discovered in Vatican archives centuries later, provides a clinical description of Lorenzo's final state that reads like a medical horror story. Da Vigo wrote that the patient showed complete dissolution of the nervous faculties, with tremors so severe as to shake the very bed frame. Most disturbing was his observation that Lorenzo seemed to be aware of his own deterioration and, filled with constant terror, on May 4, 1519, the same day Hernan Cortes landed in Mexico to claim new worlds for Spain, Lorenzo di Piero di Medici died alone in his chambers, his body finally succumbing to decades of genetic damage. He was 26 years old and had never truly lived a single day as the banking heir. He was born to be. The autopsy, performed secretly by Dr. Da Vigo, revealed the true extent of the genetic catastrophe. Lorenzo's brain showed signs of severe developmental abnormalities, with regions responsible for motor control and coordination dramatically underdeveloped. His nervous system displayed what the physician described as architectural chaos, neural pathways that seemed to lead nowhere and muscle control mechanisms that contradicted each other. With Lorenzo's death, the Medici banking dynasty effectively ended. There were no male heirs, no succession plan, and no leadership capable of managing the financial empire. Within 6 months, creditors had seized most Medici assets. The Palazzo Medici was sold to rival banking families. The family's famous art collection was scattered across Europe as loan collateral. The psychological impact on surviving family members was devastating. Lorenzo's aunt, Maddalena di Medici, wrote in her final letter that we have destroyed ourselves through our own greed for genetic perfection. We sought to concentrate genius and instead concentrated madness. God has punished our pride with the cruelest possible judgment. The Medici banking empire's collapse sent shockwaves throughout European finance. Thousands of employees lost their livelihoods. Entire trade networks built around Medici credit systems collapsed overnight. The economic disruption contributed to political instability across Italy and helped trigger the Italian wars that would devastate the peninsula for decades. Perhaps most ironically, the family's pursuit of genetic purity had achieved the exact opposite of their intentions. Rather than concentrating banking genius, generations of inbreeding had concentrated genetic weakness until it produced Lorenzo di Piero, an heir so damaged that he couldn't understand money, let alone manage an empire built on financial expertise. Modern geneticists studying the Medici family tree have calculated that Lorenzo carried genetic mutations that would be considered catastrophic by contemporary standards. His condition likely included what we now recognize as severe autism, multiple developmental disabilities, and possibly Huntington's disease, all concentrated into one tragic individual. Through centuries of systematic genetic isolation, the Medici story serves as a permanent reminder that no amount of wealth or power can overcome biological reality. Their pursuit of family purity led directly to family extinction. Their attempt to control genetics through strategic marriages created a genetic monster who destroyed everything they had built. Today, when we see portraits of Lorenzo di Piero in museums, carefully painted to hide his deformities, we're looking at more than just a historical figure. We're seeing the physical manifestation of human arrogance, the biological consequence of choosing short-term political advantage over long-term genetic health. The Medici learned too late that genetic diversity isn't just beneficial, it's essential for survival. Lorenzo di Piero paid the ultimate price for his family's obsession with purity, spending his brief life trapped in a body designed by centuries of genetic manipulation to fail. In the end, the greatest banking empire in Renaissance, Europe fell not to foreign invasion or financial crisis, but to the inexorable laws of biology. Lorenzo di Piero's broken body was evolution's final verdict on the Medici strategy, and that verdict was written in twisted genes, failed organs, and a mind that never had a chance to reach its potential. The dynasty that once controlled the flow of European wealth ended with a young man who couldn't control his own hands. It was nature's ultimate irony, and Lorenzo di Piero di Medici was both its victim and its proof.